Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to a bonus episode of the Film Realist podcast. Didn't want to have a full 7 days without an episode, so I decided to open up to mailbag, and boy, well, Jermaine, you asked a bunch of questions, which I'm going to get to one at a time, and Dan, thank you for your submission, so I'm going to get through that. There shouldn't be any spoilers or time codes. I'm going to try to get this, you know what? There's not going to be any time code specifically. It's just mailbag. Here we go. There's a bunch of different questions. Let's get into all of the ones asked. All right, Jermaine, your first question was, what do I think about AI writing scripts? Now, when it comes specifically to what artificial intelligence is capable of, all I've seen from it is it seems to be really well programmed to do inspirations. And that may sound as if it could create something original, because you would have some people argue that most blockbusters or comic book films, which are technically blockbusters to some degree, but a significant amount of at least films released in theaters and even to some degree in the streaming realm. You can look at some of the action films released on Netflix and whatnot, where they seem very generic or familiar to another product. And I think AI would be capable of generating something, but it would be to a level that would maybe be even more generic or redundant, or it would lack any creativity that a human is capable of with an original thought. At least to my understanding of what AI is capable of, it shouldn't be able to generate the ideas that humans are currently capable of. There have been people who have tested by submitting, either having the AI watch all of the TV show and able to generate something familiar from that television series or film series. I've seen a couple of those around, but what it lacks is that very first idea. There's been the idea tossed around that it could be possible to create what's sort of known as in the industry as a spec script. So general ideas, but then eventually are filled out by an actual person. I think it's really dangerous to underestimate the capabilities of AI, but allowing humans to continue to get the credit for what they've created is certainly, and paid a livable wage is definitely one of the issues that the Writers Guild is currently facing and why they're on strike. I haven't addressed it yet on the show, but I do support the writers, given the fact that the industry is evolved into so many different facets of where content can now be watched or enjoyed, that AI should be something that they should protect themselves from, because the last thing studios want is to pay writers money they deserve. So I think I answered your first question there. The next you actually connects to part of the strike, which is, should writers be paid for the amount of times a show is streamed? It's really difficult to evaluate how this money should get spent, given the fact that for television, for a significant amount of time, there were these things called residuals, which were baked into the idea of a show being created. You were paid for that. And then with a residual, it was how often that show was purchased and then shown on a different network. I think streaming to some degree should be able to support this. If you are planning on running content that you have paid for, and again, not substantial amounts, given that people are not being paid livable wages, that the more something gets showed, and specifically, I think what would be an interesting way to protect these writers is if, for example, a television series is picked up for another season, those writers who were involved in the creation of the show should be brought back and they should be paid more. They are doing something, creating more content that you have decided, based on whatever analytics you may be using, that it is worthy of more, and you are investing in that show or franchise. Is that a perfect solution? Absolutely not, but I'm not a writer. Coming up with an original idea is certainly, and putting something down in the written page is not one of the skills that I feel I have. It's one of the reasons I didn't pursue entertainment journalism to some degree. I've found that the best way to express how much I love movies and television has been using my voice, which is why I've been involved in podcasting for as long as I have. So it's difficult how those analytics work. If executives, as an example, are getting bonuses for how well something streams, then I think it definitely should be taken into consideration that the writers and people involved in the creative process, not just the financials of the show, should be paid accordingly for their work. As somebody who is a member of a union, I do think it is important for these people to be protected and to be paid well for their work, depending on the responsibilities. The writers are the most important thing in the creation that leads to filming and directing. You can't do these things. These are why all of these productions are being shut down, because, and some of the listeners may not be aware of this, so I guess I'll let you know that even though a script is written, that does not mean it does not change. There's a fun article you can check out. Ryan Reynolds, as a member of the Writers Guild of America, is not allowed to do improv because that would be considered a rewrite of dialogue given how he is a member. He's allowed to act as a SAG member, Screen Actors Guild, but he's not. There's been a lot of talk about that, specifically what he can get away with in ADR, which is additional dialogue replacement, which is recorded after the movie's done filming. But it is certainly a messy situation, and I hope for the writer's sake it ends quickly. Not for the executives. I think the writers should get what they deserve, given how there is more and more places for content and more streaming services are wanting to create content. You need the writers to do so. All right, your next question, Jermaine. Who is your favorite DCU actor? I'm assuming you mean DCEU, because The Flash, which comes out in the review for this will be in a couple weeks, I guess, has not officially come out yet, or I haven't seen it yet, is what I should say. Of the DCEU, my personal favorite, I think that's really difficult. What I appreciated most about Ben Affleck's Batman is aesthetically, he looks the most like the comic book character in terms of frame and musculature and whatnot. But also getting to see a live action version of the Dark Knight Returns retired Batman is something I really enjoyed. Fans of Christian Bale's version, that it was in there to some degree, and there were some more direct elements that were taken into The Dark Knight Rises. Of all the DCEU, the expanded universe, because I guess we are getting the DCU post The Flash, that's tricky. I think I would have to say, after everything, it's Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill as Superman is a version of the character that I really did enjoy. I think Man of Steel holds up really well, and his portrayal of a modern Superman who, one of the issues writers have discussed when it comes to writing Superman is he's so powerful that doesn't make him interesting. And what I've enjoyed most from the character throughout all the different mediums, comics, television series, and films, is what challenges Superman is the humanity. And there may be people who are critical of Man of Steel and saying that obviously there's a significant amount of destruction in that film and that we don't truly get to see that through Clark and Superman Henry's version. I think being an actor who had to live up to the high bar that was Christopher Reeve's Superman and do something fresh and unique with that character, and to be a definitive version of Superman for a modern film-going audience, was really impressive. There have been multiple Batman, the Keaton, I guess it's not the Keaton, but the Burton Schumacher era. There was 3 Batman. We had one with the Bale era, and then obviously Ben Affleck. We have another one with Robert Pattinson, and likely a new one for Batman Brave and the Bold. So, yes, I'd have to say my favorite DC EU actor from that run, from Man of Steel to The Flash, was Henry Cavill. I was super excited when there was the potential of him coming back, and just as equally disappointed when he did not end up coming back, because James Gunn came in to reset everything with the DCU. All right, next question. How do you feel about the Flash director and writer getting Brave and the Bold? So in that, I'm assuming you're referring to Batman Brave and the Bold, which will be the upcoming Batman film in the DCU, which will be about Bruce and Damian Wayne, James Gunn's favorite Robin. I've talked on the podcast about how I feel about Damian Wayne. Andy Muschietti, who that is, I believe, how you pronounce his last name. I have really enjoyed his two It films. I am not a massive fan of horror films, but the two It Chapter 1 and 2 films I really enjoyed, and the balance of heart and terrifying thrill that you get from both of those films. There are two films I wound up owning, which is to say something for my limited collection of horror films. Outside of that, I think everything we're seeing from The Flash looks very good. He's handling not a Batman, I should correct myself, two Batmen with Keaton and DCEU's Ben Affleck. So I'm very curious to see how he balances working with two drastically different versions of that character. If James Gunn has the confidence, Andy Muschietti is also a writer as well. So if there is confidence from James Gunn that he is one of the creatives, he wants to continually have his voice in the DCU, that's exciting. I think that it's tough given how we have had so many versions of the character relatively recently, but my opinion on the idea for those films, I listed out in a podcast, if you'd like to listen to that one, about each of the DCU products announced in Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, but I don't really want to generate an opinion on what it could be, because my opinion is not what it's going to wind up being. I'm excited about the possibility because I think, given the chance, he's a good director, but not knowing anything about who's been cast in that, who the production designer is, what does the Batman suit look like, I kind of hope it looks like the Greg Capullo version with the yellow bat's outline of the bat symbol, but who knows about that. I haven't seen The Flash. I wish this question had come up closer to when The Flash came out, because then I would be able to have a more definitive answer, because this is the first real blockbuster that Andy is directing, even though I know It Chapter 2 had a bigger budget than It Chapter 1. So I'm excited for The Flash. I have had a emotional turnaround in what we are getting from the film. So fingers crossed that I will enjoy it as much as I'm hoping I'm going to enjoy it. What is the coolest thing about a sci-fi movie? Do you mean a sci-fi movie in general? I like the future tech, specifically with anything that has to do with travel. I'm somebody who lives, I wouldn't say remotely, but I live substantial distances from my family and some of my close personal friends. I don't like driving in the car for long periods of time. I recently did a trip to Connecticut, and that was about over 9 hours of driving from where I am. And then having to do that again 3 days later was not something I enjoyed. So remote travel, I know, is something that people have in their cars today, but being able to fly in a car would be super cool. Flying in general is more and more expensive in Canada, specifically even with flying in our own country, which is super annoying if you want to get to explore the other provinces. Me living in Ontario. And so that's what I like the most. I like the travel, and anytime tech can feel remotely real and lived in, practical, has its defects, that's some of my favorite elements of sci-fi tech. The out-of-world fantasy stuff of Star Wars is also really great, but specifically what has to do with how travel has evolved, that's probably one of my favorite things about science fiction in general. And finally, if I was able to write a movie under a genre, what would it be? It's gonna sound really stupid, but I don't think I would ever be capable of being a screenwriter. I've written one script in my entire life, and that took a lot of work. Maybe I'll do another episode on what that was supposed to be. A movie similar to that eventually did come out, and based on the idea that I had, unfortunately, I don't think it was as interesting, and it missed the emotional point of the last. It was a sequel to something. I'm not going to say what it was, but I've talked about it on other podcasts. So I would love to be somebody involved in story pitch ideas. I think I'm somebody who would be capable of coming up with an idea around a certain intellectual property in the comic book area, but the fine details of writing dialogue, scene direction, and camera angles, any of those specific things that are required for a good screenplay, I don't think I'd be capable of, and pretending that I would be able to do it, I think undermines what actual screenwriters are capable of. So that's what I would have to say Yeah, comic books maybe sounds like it's just a cop out answer, but that's the thing I'm most interested in, quite frankly. There are more specific ideas I have for characters we already have in the MCU and the DCU, but they're more predictions because those films have yet to come out. So that's, I think, where my best abilities lie, is in the ideas, and then the finer execution should be done by somebody with those skills, because I personally don't think that I have those. And thanks, Jermaine, so much for your questions. I really appreciate it. The next one we have here is from Dan Vogel. It says, what two intellectual properties / franchises would you love to see crossover in a movie? And what would be the event that caused the crossover? Difficulty: you can't use DC or Marvel characters. That's really interesting. There are universes that are owned by the same property. If this is not a movie, well, you know what? Here I go. I'm going to pitch you this movie, even though technically, I know they're two different properties. I'm talking around the answer, which would be, I was a big fan of the two television series that were on USA, which was Suits and White Collar. Now, they both took place in New York. Interestingly enough, White Collar did shoot in New York, but Suits didn't. It shot in Toronto, which is super funny. One had less episodes, but one ran for significantly longer seasons. But I think White Collar, I believe, was only about 5 seasons, if not 6. And specifically, what I'd love to see is characters Harvey and Neil, who was played by Matt Bomer. Those two characters seemed written to have some form of conflict, whether that was a con that had to do with Harvey Specter or a lawsuit to some degree that Neil was involved with in White Collar. I think would be a lot of fun. The tones and the wittiness of those two characters back and forth would be super interesting. And then if you also throw in Peter and Mike, so Peter from White Collar and Mike from Suits, with all the pop culture-ness, and Neil being somebody who was like a wine sommelier and an art connoisseur, I think those things would have been really interesting together. And you would have been able to do a bigger budget version of that to really embrace the spectacle of the white collar high society that those television series maybe would not have been able to do on a TV show budget. That's probably super specific. I don't know if any of my listeners have watched Suits or White Collar, so that would be a crossover that I would be interested in. Another one that doesn't have to do with DC or Marvel, I really did want to see a version of Jason Bourne and Jeremy Renner's character. While I was not a huge fan, I don't know if that technically counts. No, you know what? I'm going to scratch that. They were in the same universe, so that doesn't really matter. There are versions of this that's really cool. The obvious answer is like G.I. Joe and Transformers. They're both owned by Paramount, and given the fact that Transformers, historically speaking, has a ton of army-related characters, I think that makes the most sense and could some degree explain how insane some of the technology gets with the G.I. Joes. Outside of that, I think, honestly, after speaking about my Suits and White Collar crossover, that's really the one I would want. And it would be a revival of those shows in a film form. I know Psych, the USA show, has had multiple films, so that'd be something that I would look forward to seeing. I'm trying to think. What else would I want to see in a weird crossover? You know what? I would love to see a version. This is just off the top of my head. I would love to see a version of Indiana Jones and Zorro. I'm a big fan of swashbuckling films and action adventure. It's why Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is my most looking forward to, my most anticipated movie of 2023. I think that would be super fun. Indiana Jones has always managed to play around with history, and having somebody, given that it could be in the past, how does somebody like Zorro function during World War II? Maybe Indy goes to Spain if they want to have the film take place there, or he goes to Mexico. I think that would be super fun, and there are characters who both love whips. The Mask of Zorro is one of my favorite action adventure movies of all time, and Raiders of the Lost Ark is my favorite movie of all time. So there's two for you. I've got a Suits and a White Collar crossover, and I've got an Indiana Jones and a Mask of Zorro crossover. I hope you like those, Dan. Why don't you send me your ideas? I know Jermaine posted his, which was Terminator versus Riddick movie. That would require Vin Diesel to have somebody taller than him in a movie, Jermaine. So I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. I appreciate the questions that the listeners sent out. If you want to have a question answered, follow the Film Twitter account for the Film Realists podcast, or you can message on Instagram. There is a TikTok now for the podcast where I'm going to be posting clips. Let me know if you have any other questions there. You can also follow me on Twitter personally at Kyle_Naranya. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode of the podcast. Next week's review will be of Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I hope to see you on the next one.